Almost everything that lives on the land depends on clean, fresh water for its survival. But clean water is becoming scarce in many parts of the world. The Gouritz region in South Africa is a case in point, a region in crisis, with low and variable rainfall and where the current demand for water is already exceeding the supply. A burgeoning human population, pollution of water courses, excessive nutrient runoff are all putting huge pressure on already limited resources. Poor maintenance of urban water systems and broken pipes allow tens of millions of litres of water to run to waste. Erosion of farmland carries off millions of tons of valuable topsoil every year and silts up the rivers. And to add insult to injury, alien vegetation that drinks huge amounts of water while giving us very little in return is spreading through the Klein Karoo and its coastal rivers like wildfire. Despite this, many people carry on using water as if the supply was endless, even though we know now that shortage of fresh water has become one of the most critical issues on the planet. It's true, we never appreciate the importance of water till the tap runs dry. A new reserve has been created in South Africa's Western Cape province that will, among other things, help to protect the water supplies of the Gouritz region. The reserve stretches more or less from Swellendam in the west to Uniondale in the east, and from the Swartberg Mountains in the north to the Indian Ocean in the south. It takes in the whole of the Gouritz River and its tributaries, in other words, the major water catchments of the Klein Karoo. The Gouritz Cluster Biosphere Reserve, as it's known, the GCBR for short, has been set up to conserve the environment of the Klein Karoo and to promote the wise use of its resources, especially fresh water. Scarcity of fresh water is already inhibiting the area's future development prospects.
You look at that highest peak over there, okay? That is the Osberg over there. And the area they're going to work in, okay?
The GCBR, working with existing organizations and communities, hopes to encourage changes in the region's management of water use.
Where that saddle is, that area over there.
A water catchment is an area where all the rain falling on the land surfaces that you can see will drain off to the lowest point and into some river or dam in the vicinity where it will become available for our use. A properly functioning watershed is therefore critically important for the future survival of everything that lives here. A river carries rainwater from the catchment and all the nutrients needed to maintain its habitat and life. It's also a corridor for plants and animals to migrate along according to the seasons. The Gouritz River runs almost directly north-south through the center of the reserve for almost 270 kilometers and links the Great Karoo to the Indian Ocean. Along with the other rivers, it provides the coastal estuaries of the GCBR with the fresh water they need in order to fulfill their vital functions as nurseries for the marine life offshore in the Indian Ocean. Without a good flow of fresh water from inland, estuaries become hypersaline, which is detrimental to their nursery function. The marine fish stocks inevitably decline, and this, combined with unrestricted overfishing taking place along the coast, spells disaster for many inshore fishermen. The GCBR came into existence as a result of the international scientific program that has identified 34 biodiversity hotspots around the world. A hotspot is defined as a region that has at least 1,500 species of endemic plants, in other words, plants that occur nowhere else on Earth, and that is under serious threat because at least 70% of it has already been destroyed or badly damaged by human activity. In other words, they're ecosystems or biomes in need of urgent protection. There are 3 here in the Western Cape: Fynbos, Succulent Karoo, and subtropical thicket. And the GCBR's primary focus is to coordinate the efforts to save them from further damage. South Africa's Cape Floristic region, as it's known, has around 9,500 recorded plant species spread over the 3 hotspots. Botanists call this the world's hottest hotspot for plant diversity. Subtropical thicket has far more trees, shrubs and climbers than the other 2 hotspots, and is often so dense and closely packed that most of the smaller species are hidden from view. This structure makes thicket an important migration corridor for wildlife. Since it's also a good source of food, thicket supports a rich population of invertebrates. The world's hotspots taken together are critically important because in 34 relatively small areas dotted around the globe, they support 60% of the Earth's plant and animal species. Many of these, mainly because of ongoing human impact, face extinction. And extinction is forever. The GCBR's role in protecting the 3 hotspots here is therefore vital for the preservation of the little that remains of our natural heritage. Farmers have always regarded thicket as good for their stock. In many areas this has led to overgrazing, the removal of the ground cover, increased erosion and poor recharge of the underground water systems. Despite its seeming richness, thicket doesn't recover easily from overgrazing, so the problems continue. Thicket also occurs on the lower mountain slopes, and in places where the soil is not so rich it becomes fragmented and often mixed with succulent karoo vegetation. The boundaries between the hotspots are rarely sharply defined, and there's often quite a lot of overlapping between neighbours. But generally their appearance is quite distinctive. The Succulent Karoo hotspot spreads far beyond the Klein Karoo into the Northern Cape and Namibia. It has the richest diversity of succulent flora in the world, with almost 6,000 species of plants with thick fleshy leaves or stems that can store water and withstand the drought and extremes of temperature that are typical of the region. About half of these plant species are found only here in southern Africa. Since there are virtually no trees and very few tall shrubs in the Succulent Karoo habitat, larger mammals have always found it somewhat uninviting. Nevertheless, many of the plants and a lot of the animals that live here have created fierce defenses for themselves. Lizards, on the other hand, are far more laid back and simply dodge out of sight at the first sign of trouble. Tortoises are widespread, and in the Succulent Karoo biome, many, such as this leopard tortoise, play a role in the seed dispersal of some of the plant species. Most of the lower-lying areas of the Succulent Karoo, where the soil is good, have been used for farming at some stage. And in springtime, especially after rain, mass flowering occurs on the lands that have been degraded. Although a high proportion of the Succulent Karoo's plants are threatened, only about 2.5% of the biome is formally protected at the moment. Fynbos is probably the best known of the 3 biodiversity hotspots in the Klein Karoo. Proteas, the emblematic flowers of the fynbos, are known and admired all over the world. But fynbos is made up of many shrubby evergreen plants and fine-leafed shrubs, which is where the name fynbos comes from, and restial reeds that survive on rocky, sandy soils, mainly on the higher ground. Fynbos has one of the highest concentrations of plant species in the world, with about 9,000 species, 6,000 of them unique to South Africa, a floral diversity greater than that of many tropical forest regions. It makes up less than 1% of the land area of southern Africa, but sadly has the country's highest concentration of threatened species, which of course is why it's a hotspot in the first place and why South Africa has been given special responsibility to ensure that it's not damaged further. Mountain fynbos is one of southern Africa's richest areas for endemic butterflies, even though the winds that generally blow here often make flying difficult for them. Much of the fynbos occurs in the higher mountains. It plays an important role in providing clean, fresh water to the land below, but it's very sensitive to human activity, mainly because so many of the plants are extremely localized. So that if land is cleared for farming or a 4x4 trail is bulldozed into the mountains, it could easily wipe out the only population of a particular species. To make matters worse, many plants, in fact in all 3 hotspots, have such close relationships with particular insect species that if either one was to go extinct for any reason, the other would be unable to survive and would soon follow. This in turn could cause a domino collapse of links in other chains that we don't yet even know about. This is why the GCBR's role in protecting the hotspots is critical. The commonest wildlife in the mountain fynbos, which you can see almost everywhere, are probably lizards and agamas. Just about every rock and crevice has one or more. And dassies also occur on many of the rocky outcrops. Dassies are browsers or grazers depending on what is available. They feed for about an hour a day and for the rest of the time lounge in the sun. It's obviously a great way of life. Because of the leached and nutrient-poor soils, fynbos vegetation is fairly unpalatable, and as a result there are not a lot of large mammals around. But klipspringers are obviously happy enough with whatever they get for the males to display their ownership of a territory to their rivals. Baboons are found pretty well all over, sometimes in troops numbering up to 100 or more. They eat insects and plants and whatever else they come across, and spend the nights in the high kranzes trying to avoid their main predator, the leopard. Even though they're mainly nocturnal, 28 leopards have been positively identified in a 3,000 square kilometre area around the headwaters of the Gouritz River as part of a project by the Cape Leopard Trust. Not enough research has yet been done to establish if this is a healthy population for a district of this size, but the only way to count them is with remote cameras set up in pairs to record the distinctive markings on both sides of the animals. But the GCBR is not just about saving rare plants and charismatic animals. It's also about protecting and restoring those things that scientists call ecosystem services: breathable air, clean water, food, and so on. In other words, the fundamental life support systems that the survival of everything depends on. It begins here at ground level, usually in the mountains, where lichens, fungi, and mosses, acting like giant sponges, soak up the rain that falls in the catchment. This living crust, as it's called, holds the water long enough so that it has time to percolate into the soil. This not only nourishes the soil bacteria and it keeps the plants alive, it also recharges the underground aquifers that feed the springs, which in turn keep the groundwater in the lowlands at an accessible level. Rainfall in the Klein Karoo varies from 100 millimeters a year in some of the arid lowlands to over 1,000 millimeters on the mountain tops. The living crust, especially in the mountains, is therefore critically important. By releasing the rainfall in a controlled way, the crust helps to prevent flooding and erosion and ensures a consistent supply of clean water to the lowlands. In the upper reaches of the Gouritz River, there are still some small endemic fish species that have been here since the ancient continent of Gondwanaland broke apart, separating Australia from the African continent. The Cape Galaxias, for instance, are part of the same family as the Galaxias found in Australia, which means they've been around for at least 150 million years. Indigenous fish are important indicators of a healthy river system, and checking periodically on the river's population of Galaxias, redfin, minnows and Cape Kerpers, like this one, gives a quick overview of the status of the river. Unfortunately, all of these indigenous fish are currently facing the threat of extinction, either from alien plants in the headwaters, which damage the riverbanks, or from alien fish species that have been introduced and that either predate on them or compete with them for food and space. But by far the most important part of the conservation story in the three hotspots lies beneath our feet. Terrestrial life depends totally on the thin layer of soil that blankets this planet, and on the things that live in it, the plants, the animals, and the bacteria, fungi, algae, and so on. They are largely invisible and mostly ignored, even by many conservationists, yet by weight they make up 80% of the land-based life on this planet. In simple terms, they are what makes life on Earth possible, and when their habitats are thoughtlessly destroyed, bulldozed for roads, farming lands or new housing estates, then all we are doing is reducing still further the chances that our children and our children's children will have a future to look forward to in a world that we ourselves have already seriously damaged. It's widely accepted now that the Earth is a living self-regulating organism. Together, the soil communities, working ceaselessly, collect and recycle organic matter, decompose it, and mine minerals from deep underground to produce the nutrients needed to enable the plants above them to grow, to produce the air we breathe, the food we need, and to maintain the natural fertility of the earth for everything that lives on it. It's an endless cycle that knows no waste, that has worked for millions of years, day and night, hour by hour, and grain by single grain to keep it all functioning. It's a lesson we would do well to learn. If we are in any doubt about the importance of nature to our survival, all we have to do is look at the honeybee. As humans, we depend on honeybees to pollinate about 90% of our food crops. If honeybees disappear, and they may already be in serious trouble for reasons that we don't yet understand, then virtually all arable farming as we know it would collapse within a few years, and the world would face starvation on a massive scale. The ecosystem service provided by this one tiny insect is critical to our survival. And there are undoubtedly tens of thousands of other equally important connections in nature that we haven't even discovered yet, but that keep it all operating for our benefit. This is why, apart from its own intrinsic value, it makes sense for us to save as much of it as we can while we still have a chance. Unfortunately, over the last couple of hundred years, farming and other human activities have seriously damaged large areas of the Klein Karoo. Overstocking with goats and sheep led to severe overgrazing of the upland areas, and the big feet of the ostriches did huge damage to the veldt when many farms were grossly overstocked during the boom years of the feather industry in the mid-1850s. The severe loss of biodiversity and serious erosion across large parts of the hotspot biomes are still with us. Stripped of its protective cover, there's nothing on the veldt to hold the water back when it rains. The soil is simply washed away, causing flooding and heavy siltation downstream. A disaster for the water catchment functions of the rivers. In the valleys where the soil is fertile, the natural vegetation was bulldozed to make way for crops. As much as 80% of the lowland habitat has been transformed, and this, along with the use of agricultural chemicals, has also seriously affected the region's biodiversity. Almost all of the arable farming in the Klein Karoo is dependent on irrigation. Historically, most of it was flood irrigation, and for its time it was very effective, but it means that nowadays farming uses about 80% of all the available water. In a semi-arid region where the evaporation is frequently 10 times higher than the annual rainfall, it's not a very efficient use of a scarce resource. To put it in perspective, to grow a kilogram of grapes takes about 750 litres of water. A kilogram of mutton takes about 10,000 litres, and a kilogram of beef about 15,000 litres. A good argument for vegetarianism, perhaps. In the southern parts of the GCBR domain, many of the hills have been cleared to make farmland. Habitat destruction and fragmenting natural ecosystems disrupts the migration routes of many plants and animals and upsets the delicate balance that keeps ecosystems healthy. Similarly with roads that are bulldozed into the hills to create 4x4 routes for so-called ecotourists or to access farming lands and holiday homes. All of them reduce the ability of the ecosystem to function properly. To make matters worse, as much as 20 million hectares of South Africa is believed to be infested with alien plants. Oleander, blue gums, Spanish reed, black wattles. On a countrywide basis, alien plants use up something like 7% of the available water without giving much in return. But for the Gouritz domain, which already has a water crisis, they're a disaster, seriously reducing the flow of the rivers and invading the few functioning wetlands that still remain in the lower reaches. Wetlands, through their sponge action, are critical for purifying water and controlling floods. But sadly, in times of drought, they're often viewed by farmers as a handy reservoir, not realizing that if you breach their integrity by cutting a channel to access the water, wetlands often simply bleed out or start to seriously erode. In the end, this generally leads to the demise of the wetland itself, as the peat dries out and ceases to function as a sponge. With their reduced flow and increased sediment loads and more obstructions, it's no surprise that many of the rivers of the catchment are silting up. It's an alarming situation because rivers are indispensable corridors for plants and animals to migrate along according to the seasons, and perhaps more importantly, in response to looming climate change. But crucially, when rivers start to dry up, it starves the coastal estuaries of the fresh water they need in order to survive. Despite knowing this, we still build roads and viaducts that hinder the water flow and even cut many estuaries off from their surrounding marshes and salt flats. They no longer have access to the plant detritus that often plays a life and death role in the estuary food web. Streams become stagnant and polluted, over-enriched with nutrients, and often toxic. As the human population mushrooms, pressure is increasing still more on the world's sensitive environments. People, because of our lifestyle demands, have already done irreparable damage to most of the Earth's ecosystems, including destroying 70% of the 3 biodiversity hotspots covered by the GCBR. Yet we continue to build houses in inappropriate places on the coastal floodplains, and to trample and drive on the salt marshes. South Africa's population is increasing at the rate of about 2,500 per day. Here in the Klein Karoo, where the levels of unemployment and poverty are already high, meeting the basic needs of a growing population is a major challenge. Scarcity of water is already a severe handicap on further development, and greater demands on the environment will simply not be sustainable into the future. Unfortunately, urban planners living in towns and cities with all their services on tap often seem to forget that we all ultimately depend on nature for our survival, and that by destroying ever more of the natural vegetation, all we are doing is reducing our prospects for the future virtually to zero. So what can be done? Well, the truth is we need to do a lot of things at the same time. The single biggest threat to the region's biological diversity now is alien vegetation. In fact, the Fynbos hotspot and its associated river systems is by far the worst affected in the whole country. Hydrologists say that alien vegetation in the Western Cape could already be using up to 15% of the region's annual rainfall. The Working for Water program, started in 1995 by the Department of Water Affairs, works in partnership with local communities and has provided training and jobs for well over 3,000 people in the Klein Karoo who wouldn't otherwise have work. The job is urgent because unless we can get on top of it, the area infested by alien vegetation is expected to double in the next 15 or so years. If it does, the consequences for the region will be catastrophic, and any talk about development and economic growth here will simply be a waste of time. The reality is there has to be a serious program of control and rehabilitation on many fronts. There's little point in removing alien vegetation, for instance, if at the same time nothing is being done about the wetlands. The government's Working for Wetlands program is rehabilitating some of the damaged wetlands and also at the same time providing job opportunities and skills training for local people. Here they're attempting to repair the damage done to a peat wetland before the entire system simply stops functioning and creates further major problems downstream. And here, where farming was done so close to the riverbank that the protective vegetation was uprooted and its stability was destroyed, gabions have been built to try and stop further erosion and siltation during times of flood. Biological monitoring of the rivers is used to keep an eye on the pollution levels and overall health of the water. SAS, the so-called South African scoring system, rates invertebrate families according to their tolerance to certain levels of pollution. So when specific species are present or absent in the samples, it gives a quick overview of the state of the river's health. The runoff that often carried agricultural chemicals into the waterways in the past is being reduced as more and more farmers switch from flood to drip and spray irrigation. It's not only more efficient to put the water exactly where it's needed, but the evaporation associated with the old flood irrigation methods has been dramatically reduced. The downside is, since flood irrigation operates by gravity and therefore has virtually no pressure over the flat lowland areas, farmers have had to invest heavily in building dams and installing piping and powerful pumping systems. Ostriches continue to be big business in the Klein Karoo. They still account for 90% of the world market in ostrich products and are the largest contributor to the region's economy. But the industry too has learned its lesson from the past. Most slaughter birds are now grown out in feedlots, and breeding birds too, usually a male and 2 females, are now kept in quarter-hectare pens. This gives the previously damaged parts of the farm a chance to recover and to be rehabilitated. Places in the more arid districts that were heavily overgrazed by domestic stock in the past, sometimes to 20 times more than the recommended stocking rate, are unlikely to recover much within a human-scale time frame without active assistance. This is why Working for Water is supporting a number of experimental projects where speckboom cuttings are being planted on degraded land. Speckboom are the dominant shrubs over large areas of the Thicket biome. They grow fairly quickly, at least by arid climate standards, and the hope is that they may become nursery plants, providing the kind of microclimated protective cover needed for seedlings to survive. It will be a long and very slow process, but without it, there's little chance that a functional biodiversity will ever be recovered in many areas. In a few places, especially in the southern parts of the GCBR, where the natural vegetation is still in good condition and is being properly cared for, the ecosystem provides products and work opportunities on an ongoing sustainable basis. There's a good demand for restio reeds for thatching, for instance. And the nice thing is, as with most of the products from the veld, no great inputs are needed. Once the reeds have been cut, nature simply grows them again for another crop. South Africa's proteas are already well known and have established a good market overseas because of their quality. Like the reeds, provided they're harvested on a sustainable basis, they offer long-term prospects for work for local people. Elsewhere, herbs, medicinal plants and unique teas from the veld offer similar opportunities. Of course, none of these enterprises provide employment on an industrial scale. But then, on the other hand, neither do they require industrial-scale capital investment. Honeybees, as we saw earlier, already play a pivotal role in our survival through the pollination of many of our food crops. But it doesn't end there. The honey they make, especially from fragrant Fynbos plants, is much sought after and is providing many small-scale entrepreneurs with the chance to make a living. One of the most distinctive plants in the region is Aloe ferox. Cutting its lower leaves off might seem like an act of destruction, but actually it's one of rejuvenation. It stimulates them to grow vigorously again. For centuries, indigenous healers in the Klein Karoo have been treating their patients with the sap and gel of this plant. But in recent years, its value for cosmetics and skincare has also been recognized, and aloe products are now exported worldwide. In fact, this is what the GCBR, among other things, is aiming for: decent livelihoods and prospects for the region's people, based on the sustainable use of its unique natural resources. The tragedy is that with the destruction of the hotspots, so much of this potential has been lost. The challenge is, what can be done now to save what is left from further damage, and to try and put it right? As we've become more aware of the close relationship there is between healthy ecosystems and our own survival, it's clear that small, isolated pockets of habitat on their own are not sustainable. And even the wildlife corridors linking them together are no substitute for large continuous areas of protected land, such as the provincial nature reserves. But funding for such biome-scale projects is no longer available, which is why Cape Nature is now exploring a range of stewardship options with landowners. Since freshwater scarcity will continue to be a severe limitation on any conventional farming, many landowners are now looking at alternative, more natural ways of using the land: conservancies, private reserves, game farms, and so on. Game translocation is stressful for animals, but modern techniques such as netting from a helicopter are quick and efficient and reduce the trauma to a minimum. Once the animals are in their new home, they settle down very quickly. Some farmers already have animals on their land that are alien to this area, Lechwe and Impala for instance, and any new application to Cape Nature to introduce animals that didn't historically occur in the Klein Karoo will be based on an audit of the farm's potential and strictly in line with the stocking rates that will not result in further damage to the veld. Amazing how large black and white animals, like these rare mountain zebras, can simply blend into the background. People come from all over the world to the Klein Karoo to experience its unique floral diversity. And it may be that tourism, with all the money and employment opportunities it brings, will prove to be one of the quickest returns the region gets from protecting and restoring what is left of the 3 biodiversity hotspots. But most people come simply to experience the huge landscapes, the wide skies, the solitude and the silence. Tranquility of the kind that can be found here is becoming a rare commodity in much of the world, and more tourists, especially from the already overcrowded countries of Europe, are seeking for the stillness and spiritual calm that can be found in huge and natural landscapes largely untouched by man. In a world where the human population is expected to reach 12 billion by the year 2050, it's something that is becoming more valuable with every day that passes. But, like the proverbial goose that lays the golden egg, the potential can easily be killed if pristine landscapes and views are defiled, and if things that spoil the experience are allowed to continue befouling the countryside. Local municipalities, in collaboration with the GCBR, need to ensure that the things that make this part of Africa special and that the tourists come here to experience are not carelessly destroyed. In the end, the Gouritz Cluster Biosphere Reserve is not just about game farms, charismatic animals and encouraging tourism. They are the valuable economic spin-offs that come from looking after our unique environment properly. What it's really about is protecting what remains of the 3 biodiversity hotspots and those critical ecosystem services that they provide, in particular the provision of clean water, on which our very survival in this region will depend. The choices we make now will have long-term consequences for the future sustainability of the Gouritz region, and for the health, quality of life, and prosperity of all the people that live here.